Welcome, everyone. I'm Wendy Carlin, co-director of the Stone Centre at UCL, and we're delighted to have so many of you with us from all over the world, at least in feasible time zones. We've got a great representation, and we'll be recording this, as you can see, so that you can let people know who are asleep that they can catch up on this later on. So this is the inaugural Stone Centre dialogue convened by the Stone Centre on wealth concentration, inequality, and the economy at UCL. And we're really grateful for the support of the Stone Foundation and for the growing Stone network around the world. So Branko is here from the centre at CUNY, for example. Anna, I know, is affiliated with at least one of the centres, probably more by now. And of course, we're very grateful to the participation of our panelists. One of the big missions of our particular Stone Centre is to recruit and support a new cohort of researchers interested in understanding the causes and consequences of inequality. And if that's you, and if you leave this session with more questions than answers, then the session will have been a success. So I'm going to hand over to John Cassidy from The New Yorker, who's going to chair the discussion. His own book, Capitalism and Its Critics, published this year, deals itself in novel ways with a series of thinkers asking the why and the so what about inequality in a capitalist economy. So John, it's over to you to introduce the panel.
Okay, thank you very much, Wendy. I'd just like to say thank you to you and the Stone Centre and to everybody for inviting me on. Great privilege and honour to be part of this dialogue. I thought I should just start by introducing the panel, then I'll say a few words, and then the way we're organising this, it's what my daughters refer to as a flipped classroom. The panelists are going first, and then the authors of the two books are going to get the chance to fight back. So our panel today is Branko Milanovic, who's a senior scholar at the Stone Centre at CUNY, and obviously a leading figure in the study of inequality going back decades now. And he's the author of the book Visions of Inequality, which came out in 2023 and provided a history of thinking about inequality over the last couple of hundred years. The other author on the panel is David Leigh Williams, who's a professor of political science at DePaul University. And his book, Author of the Greatest of All Plagues, came out in 2024. And that takes the story even further back to the ancient Greeks and dealing with inequality too. Beatrice Cherrier will be joining us, but happily has just made it and is one of the primary discussants. She's another eminent historian of economic thought at the CNRS, researcher at the Crest Center in Paris, and is also the author of the well-known and blog, The Undercover Historian, which I'm an avid reader of. Finally, we have Anna Stansbury, who is an assistant professor at MIT Sloan and one of the star young Labour economists, and is an affiliated scholar at the Stone Centre at CUNY as well, and was recently named by Poets and Quants one of the best 40 under 40 MBA professors. So a very distinguished panel. You might ask, why am I on it as a mere journalist? And I think the main reason is because I have been covering inequality as a sort of journalistic story for 30 years now. I joined the New Yorker in 1995, and just talking before we went live, that I think the two big papers or two big academic trends which turned inequality into a big journalistic story were the World Bank studies, which Branko wrote the first paper in 1999, and there was another one in 2000, using the World Bank's $1 a day poverty line to talk about big changes in poverty and inequality over the last 30 years. The trends being, of course, as Branko explained in his previous book, a big rise in the sort of incomes of the middle class in developing countries, especially India and China, and a stagnation of stagnation of incomes in the middle class in developed world, which Branko and his co-author illustrated memorably in their elephant curve diagram. The other big development, I think, in my career anyway, is the work associated on a more domestic level with Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Sayers and their colleagues Anthony Atkinson in the UK. And the first big paper there came out in, I think, 2002, which was Piketty's, I think it was called Inequality in the United States, 1913 to 1998 or something like that. And that had the now famous U-curve showing inequality at a historic high in 1913, then gradually falling over the course of most of the 20th century, then rising again with the rise of Thatcher, Reagan, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it. So that's the sort of, ever since then, I think, what that did from a journalistic point of view anyway, was give reporters and writers like myself the sort of materials we could use to write popular stories about the inequality trends. So I think that was the biggest development. I mean, inequality obviously has been a subject forever, really, in economics. I mean, I just looked at my own book here, and I have a chapter on William Thompson, who was a pre-Marxian socialist, who was a sort of Irish laird, who wrote a book in the 1824, I think it came out, and it was called An Inquiry into the Principles of the Distribution of Wealth Most Conducive to Human Happiness. And I'll give you a quick quote from it. How comes it, Thompson asked, that a nation abounding more than any other in the rude materials of wealth, in machinery, dwellings and food, in intelligent and industrious producers, with all the apparent means of happiness, shall still pine in privation? And the answer that he came up with was that basically the underlying cause of inequality is that society is divided into two classes, what he called the propertyless producers, what we would call the working class, and the property-owning elite of capitalists. He actually he didn't use the term capitalist itself, because I think that didn't come in until the 1840s. But basically, the basic dividing line in society was, was the class divide. Obviously, there are many other elements of inequality: racial inequality, gender inequality, regional inequality, and they've sort of featured through all the years of the subjects. I mean, if you go back to 1970, David's book, he'll talk about it, and other people will talk about it. Inequality subject has been there forever. If you go back to Mill in the 19th century, his discussion of the wages fund, which he then reneged on. Henry George, the best-selling book of the late 19th century in the US, Progress and Poverty, was basically a discussion of inequality. By the time I started studying economics in the early 80s in Oxford, it had somehow disappeared from the field. Branko has much more to say on this topic in his book, but it really resonated with me, because by then I think a couple of things had happened in sort of theoretical terms. On one side, the whole sort of microeconomic comparisons of interpersonal utility were not allowed. They'd been ruled out in the sort of 1950s by very well-meaning people like Ian Little and Kaldor and Skitowski. It wasn't seen as a legitimate thing to compare individual utilities. So how do you get over that? Well, then it naturally pushes you sort of to no-cost gains like Pareto optimums, etc. So that sort of restricted the debate, I think. And then the other thing was just a sort of lack of data, I think. There wasn't the great reams of data we have on inequality now. When I went back to do a master's in economics at NYU in the late 1990s, I was lucky to do a class under Ed Wolfe, who was one of the great sort of pioneers of wealth studies and still is in the US. So I started to pick up on that. And then I think that he already had a book talking about the sort of 90-10 distributions, both wealth and income. So he was a real pioneer. Doesn't get the credit which he deserves, I don't think. But then, as I said, everything changed when the World Bank and Piketty came along. And then ever since then, economic inequality has obviously been a huge subject. So that's how I see it. And, as I said, I've written, don't know how many articles about various aspects of it over the years. So it's great to have two books who take it back beyond my sort of 30-year timeline and go straight back to the beginning. I mean, I see both of these books. My book is in the same sort of the same sort of bailiwick as looking back from the present. I mean, I think we're all guilty of presentism. I think all historians are guilty of presentism. But there's nothing wrong with that, I don't think. And both of these books sort of, we're now 25 years into what I would call the modern study of inequality. So where they both give us a sort of perspective on history in the context of 25 years of studies. So that's how I would frame them. But as I said, I'm just a journalist, so who cares what I say? I'd like to pass. We're going to move on to the actual experts in the field. And as I said, it's a flipped format here. We're going to start out with David's book. And Branko, I believe you've prepared some comments on what you think of it.
Well, thank you very much, John. Actually, let me just say a few words about John. This is his book. So, you know, it's a pretty heavy book, which I liked very much. But now I'm going to say a few things about David's book. It's here. John, how many minutes do I have? I forgot the 5?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. First of all, of course, I enjoyed David's book. And as David knows, actually, first I didn't know that he was writing the book. Then I cannot remember how exactly I found. Maybe he wrote to me, maybe I actually found out. Then I wrote on my blog a review, because it was striking that actually David and I, and also Daryl McMahon, were writing at the same time books about inequality that are historical books, and they had structure which was somewhat similar in the sense that we focused on key canonic authors. And so that was really sort of unexpected similarity, although the books really look from very different angles. My book is very clearly looking at inequality and trying to piece together how important authors, I actually start with François Quesnay and end with Piketty, with Kuznets, how they thought about inequality. David's book goes much further, because it actually starts with Plato, goes with the Gospels, and then continues with Hobbes and Rousseau, John Stuart Mill. But there are two authors that we have in common, and they are Smith and Marx. So let me go straight into the key issue. As I said, actually, I enjoyed the book tremendously. I thought that the chapter, the discussion of Rousseau, for me, was the most poignant, in the sense that David took really, so it's like a concentrate of Rousseau's critiques of inequality. So when you read it, it is actually overwhelming how much Rousseau was not only critical, it's too simple a word to say, he was basically seeing it as a poison, actually. And when you sort of extract that alone, it really comes very powerful. Now, on Smith and Marx, we do have slightly different takes, which are due to the approach that we have taken in the book. Let me explain that. I'm sure that David will then continue, and maybe I'm sure also Beatrice and Anna might actually come in, and John. On Smith, I think actually we both have the same approach, in the sense that we highlight what is not highlighted today, and that was a very critical view that Adam Smith had about employers or masters. And I will not go through all of that, but actually he accuses them of combinations, or rather monopoly, of trying at every opportunity to cheat the public, or the only, as he calls them, the only group whose interest is opposed to the interest of the public. If you read the Chicago version of Adam Smith, all of these quotes have simply disappeared. They are not there. So now, of course, Smith was negative on all associations, including employers, but also including the state, the government. So, of course, they keep only the government part, and they don't quote at all that part where Smith is very, very negative about the employers. So both David and I agree on that. We don't fully agree, or actually, as we put it, David does not emphasize perhaps that as much as I do, the contrast between the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations. I take the theory of moral sentiments very much like against everybody else. I take it as being, in some sense, aware of inequality, but using divinity. And actually, it's a book about essentially God realizing that there is this huge inequality on the earth, but he cannot be held sort of responsible for that because he does other things to equalize, relations between the poor and the rich. And that's where he comes with, security is enjoyed by much more by the poor than the rich, because basically you have nothing to steal from the poor. Consequently, they can just lazily sun themselves along the road, on the side of the road, whereas the kings cannot do that. I think it is really an attempt to actually deculpalize divinity and to argue that equality at some other level, not at the observed level of wealth, is much greater than what we see. That world is entirely different, in my opinion. The wealth of nations, it's a world without God. And God is just gone from the wealth of nations. As I mentioned, there is mentioned divinity, God, the great maker, or whatever, is mentioned 6 times on 1,200 pages. So I really see the Wealth of Nations as being a leftist book, despite the fact that the self-interest is the center. And I see the Theory of Moral Sentiments as being essentially a book that justifies the presence and the existence of high inequality through the appeal to divinity. And that's actually very much different from Amartya Sen, for example. Now, when we come to Marx, I will be very brief on that. We also have slightly different approaches. I actually thought of David's approach, and actually in my review, I said I can really definitely see his point. David's approach is that Marx is an egalitarian thinker, and I think it is based on an ontological or philosophical or more abstract view, where Marx sees all the problems that are brought through inequality, problems of lack of esteem and self-debasement of the poor, and the problems of greed and belief on one's right to be rich, and pleonaxia, as he calls it, coming back from Plato, greed, really insatiable greed that comes from inequality and is displayed by the rich. Now, I look at Marx in the historical condition of capitalism. And within the historical condition of capitalism, I argue Marx is not an egalitarian, because for him, reduction of inequality within capitalism is not undesirable, but it's not really a primary objective. It is maybe a tool towards elimination of private property and capital and capitalism. And only after that, when we have abolished the capitalism, we would then actually discuss about, and that's what he tells actually in the critique of the Gotha program, we will then discuss how actually inequality should be. Should it be that actually people who work harder, who actually study more, they should have higher incomes, those have lower incomes. But under capitalism, really in a reduction of inequality, as he says, is really, how did he call it, like a petty bourgeois dream, and it's actually not part of the socialist movement, whose real objective is the abolition of capitalism. So there, you see, and I will stop there. I think we have slightly different takes on Marx, but I think these different takes on Marx come from our decision to look at Marx differently. And God knows, Marx is so wide in his writings that you can look from 50 different angles. My angle is strictly economic. I think that David's angle is much more philosophical, and I think actually that his argument holds if your position, if you look at Marx from that particular position.
Okay, thank you very much, Branko. Passing over to Anna now to also comment on David's book.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and it was superb to have a chance to read David's book and Branko's book in depth for this panel. I just want to introduce briefly sort of my background and why I'm sort of here and commenting on these books, I think, because I'm not a scholar of the history of thought on inequality. My work focuses very much on contemporary or recent modern inequality, going back to, say, the 70s or 80s in industrialized economies like the US and the UK. Actually, I cut my academic teeth in labor economics working on monopsony, which Branko just alluded to. Adam Smith was concerned about in terms of the combinations of employers. And I work on topics like monopsony, the labor share of income, as well as the social class background of economists themselves. So perhaps the present of economic thought. So as I was reading David's book and thinking about how it relates to how we study inequality today, I wanted to think about three contexts that shape thought then and thought now, and that affected how I would translate learnings and interesting takeouts from the book. Those three contexts are the moral and ethical context that a thinker is writing in, the economic context, and the political context. Before I talk about sort of my reflections, I just bring out some of the key themes that I thought were present in David's book that not every listener to this event might know already. I think the very, very striking point that David is making in the book is that so many major thinkers in the Western canon, right the way back from Plato, as Branko said, all the way through Jesus and the Gospels and the early Christian writers, through Hobbes and these Mill, Smith, Rousseau, Marx, all thought of economic inequality as pernicious to the common good, even though their conceptions of the common good were so different. And I think that's a very interesting takeaway in and of itself. You've got Hobbes, who thought that the effective way to reach social stability was through a political leviathan, and you've got Marx, who thought that you should have the overthrow of capitalism. You've got the religious texts from early Christianity, which are thinking very much more about the social good as living a virtuous life as prescribed by God. So that's fascinating in and of itself. And I think the reason that these thinkers identify economic inequality in particular as pernicious, as opposed to perhaps political inequality, are, number one, that it's a threat to social stability. And this comes out very clearly. David emphasizes this across all the thinkers, that economic inequality creates factions, and those factions create division that lead to instability and perhaps civil war. And the title of the book, The Greatest of All Plagues, is actually a reference to civil war itself being caused by economic inequality. The second is a threat to the moral development of the rich and the poor. And that's a very interesting one, because that comes through most of the thinkers and is not very present in our current debate about inequality, that the corrosive effect of wealth, particularly on the wealthy, is actually a socially, morally corrosive thing for them in themselves and not just for society as a whole. And the third point that comes through almost all of the thinkers, and that I'll reference in my later comments, is that inequality is bad for the welfare of the poor, because the existence of great wealth and concentration of great wealth necessarily entails deprivation of other people from material possessions, whether that's food or shelter or other material goods. And so if you're concerned about the poor and the living standard of the poor, inequality is an object of concern. So those kind of key themes, combined with the context that I thought about, brought me to what I think are as my key kind of comments that I'd love to discuss further as we go through this panel. And they'll fit to each of those three contexts: the economic context, the political context, and the moral context. So the economic context is, I think, perhaps the most striking difference between now and when most of the thinkers were concerned about economic inequality, which is we have a world with economic growth. And prior to some point that you can debate exactly when, around the industrial or agricultural revolutions, there was a world with mostly not very much and not very sustained economic growth. In a world where most people are poor, there is simply not that much material wealth, and there's no growth and therefore no prospect for the increase in broad-based material wealth. The existence of the rich necessarily entails the existence of people that are even poorer than they need to be. And so if you're worried about people barely subsisting, which was the case for a lot of human history, then the existence of the wealthy directly takes away from perhaps the exact mere survival of the poor. And in today's world, while that is true still on a global scale, that is not necessarily true in rich countries. The existence of inequality has become divorced from the necessity of the existence of poverty. And I think that actually militates against one of the core arguments that a lot of these thinkers made, which is you should be concerned about inequality because the existence of the wealthy means the existence of the very poor. That was an example an argument, for example, that Rousseau made. Like, tied along with that and the relevant again to the economic context is the idea of inequality achieved through just versus unjust means. Again, if you're in a zero-sum world, a world with no growth, then my accrual of wealth is probably coming from my dispossession of someone else. Perhaps through force, perhaps through corruption, perhaps through greed, but it's not coming through a means that is generating spillover benefits to society. Now, we can debate how true that is now, but it is at least more true that in some cases the generation of wealth actually comes with spillover benefits. For example, you invent a new technology, than necessarily coming at the expense of others. And so the idea of being in a positive sum world with growth without the necessity of absolute poverty, I think radically changes how you think socially and politically about the benefits versus costs of inequality. On the second lens, thinking about it through a political lens, and this is further outside my specialty, I'm not a political scientist, it's very striking to me that many of these arguments about inequality come in the presence of autocratic or non-democratic regimes, and in the absence of even the imagining of a feasible democratic society. And I think it's at least worth considering whether some of these political arguments about inequality are undermined by the presence of true democracy. I wouldn't argue that we necessarily have true democracy right now, but is it the case that inequality undermines social stability if that inequality is sustained by a democracy where everyone has an truly equal say in the outcome? And the third, even further from my field of specialty, is the moral and ethical context, but I think it's also worth raising, which is this idea of inequality being destructive to the soul and creating division. I'm not sure that's unique to economic inequality. And I'd be very interested on picking up that theme of whether economic inequality is uniquely divisive, uniquely corrosive, uniquely generating social divisions that lead to unrest, or if replacing economic inequality with some other form of status hierarchy would do the same thing. So those are my main comments. I'll leave it there. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much indeed. Now we're moving over to Branko's book, and David is going to go first to give his views on that. 10 minutes, please, David.
Wonderful. Thank you. I want to offer a hearty thank you, of course, to everyone for their roles in facilitating this event, to Wendy and the folks at the UCL Stone Center for imagining this discussion and their behind-the-scenes logistics, to John, Beatrice, and Anna for preparing their remarks today, but also for their incredibly important contributions to economic thought more broadly. And certainly a special thanks to Branko, of course, for writing such an important and stimulating book. So I have to begin with an admission. When I first learned of Branko's Visions of Inequality project, I was terrified. I had been working on my own inequality book for probably about 7 years by that time, when a friend informed me that a legendary economist was writing, I was told, quote, pretty much the same book. So I probably did the least responsible thing I could for as long as I could. I resisted learning any of the details about Branko's book. I felt confident that if I were to read it before finishing my own, I'd abandon writing my project and simply tell people, well, read Branko's book. He's got all the answers. Eventually and inevitably, however, Branko and I did get in touch. Branko shared his manuscript with me, and I was delighted twice over. In the first place, despite some broad similarities in our books, these really are two different, but I think complementary projects. And then I was delighted in the second respect that Branko had written an extraordinary book from which I've learned immensely. Concerning the broad similarities, we've both worked to draw attention to the fact that people didn't just start thinking about inequality in a serious way in the past couple of decades. Both Branko and I have written longue durée monographs on the development of thinking about inequality across multiple centuries. We have both organized our books around specific important thinkers. We both sought to provide some historical contextualization for each one of the thinkers we address, explaining why they were interested in inequality in the first place. And we've both, of course, as has already been mentioned, written substantial chapters on Smith and Marx. Beyond these similarities, however, our books take significantly different approaches. Most obviously, where I'm a political theorist writing about social, political, and moral issues, Branko, as an economist, reasonably focuses on economic issues. Whereas I'm expressly keen on the normative issues as addressed by my authors, Branko's analysis reflects, in his own words, quote, an indifference to normative views. Among other things, this means that whereas my book, by virtue of focusing on folks understood to be philosophers, featuring figures like Plato, of course, Branko, by virtue of focusing on economics, starts with the invention of the dismal science, hence commencing with Kisne and the physiocrats. All of this is to say, despite some important overlap in approach, these really are fundamentally two different books. One about how economists have understood inequality, another about how philosophers and then maybe one religious figure have understood inequality. I think that makes our books different, but also complementary. What's especially striking in Branko's treatment, especially in the 20th century thinkers he addresses, is how well they answer one question that I've frequently gotten when talking about my book on the road. And the question is, why do so many people stop problematizing inequality after Marx, especially economists? And Branko provides an answer that's clear and provocative, as manifested, I think, best in his treatments of Pareto and Kuznets. So I'll talk about them for a little bit. After Pareto, talking about inequality didn't make much sense because he suggested we were stuck with it, more or less, regardless of what interventions we might make to halt it. Jesus is recorded as saying in the Gospel of Mark, "You will always have the poor among you." For Pareto, it was now, "You will always have inequality amidst you." And while Kuznets is importantly different from Pareto in his optimism that inequality will eventually decline, he nevertheless assumes, like Pareto, that the laws of economic distribution are nevertheless fixed. There's little or nothing that we can do as human beings to alter these laws. All we can do is to let them play out as they must. So while Pareto and Kuznets are importantly different for all the reasons that Branko brilliantly describes, they share a certain understanding they share a certain surrendering, I should say, to the inevitability of supposed economic laws. And I think this speaks to an important difference of the temperaments separating economists from philosophers, particularly political philosophers. Economists have long sought to establish their discipline as one of the sciences. Sciences seek to discover reliable and inflexible laws. The natural sciences of early modernity, for example, sought to escape the world of contingency. It's not a science, they reasoned, if they explained natural phenomena with ad hoc appeals to miracles, as did, some of the medieval natural philosophers. Economists found inspiration in the scientific model. Indeed, even Marx finds inspiration in this kind of reasoning. While Marx was a trained philosopher, he sought to make his theories as scientific as possible. The unfolding of history is not contingent upon human agency in any real sense for him. History inevitably unfolds according to necessary laws. This scientific Marx is Branko's Marx, I think, and the one who at times seems indifferent to inequality. The morality of it all seems beside the point. The point is to prepare ourselves for the inevitable, namely the revolution and then socialism and communism. There's a reason why there's a Nobel Prize for economics, while no such parallel exists in philosophy. Philosophy, outside of some at least highly analytic variants, has really aspired to this kind of scientific rigor. All right. Let's see. Before I want to say a little bit more about Marx maybe in a minute. But before doing that, I want to spend a few minutes explaining how philosophers have differed from economists on inequality. So whereas folks like Pareto and Kuznets have set aside the question of wealth distribution as beyond human manipulation, philosophers have long understood distributive justice to be a central question of government. Plato in his Laws, for example, preferred that the richest citizens have no more than 4 times the wealth of the poorest. But there was no iron law of necessity that would make this happen on its own. It can only happen through the determined and extended efforts of governments. And that's a contingent matter. It relies on policy choices of governments, and namely the people composing those governments. So it's up to the governments and the people and the people to whom they're accountable to insist on altering patterns of wealth distribution. And they have the power to do that whenever they are sufficiently motivated. As John Stuart Mill suggested in his Principles of Political Economy, while the laws of trade, profits, and prices may resemble laws of science, the matter of distribution of wealth is entirely contingent upon policy choices. Quoting Mill, unlike the laws of production, those of distribution are of human institution, since the manner in which wealth is distributed in any given society depends on the statutes or usages therein obtaining. This is why governments, for him, can make consequential choices about inheritance taxes, for example, that would significantly redirect money from the richest to the poorest. So while Mill was in many respects an important economist, he was, I think, fundamentally a philosopher at heart. By contrast, while Marx was a trained philosopher, his desire to identify fixed laws of economics and history render him, in many respects, more of an economist than a philosopher. But this is one side of Marx. As I intimated, and as Branko himself certainly notes in his book, despite Marx's scientific pretensions, Marx often speaks in vocal and indignant moral terms. Readers can't help but feel that his economic laws are subject to a great deal of contingency. One can't read Marx's depiction of capitalists as vampires and werewolves without feeling that he wants people to do something about them, and now, and not simply wait for history to play out as it must. In my limited time remaining, and just to make things a little more interesting, I want to point to a small interpretive difference that Branko and I have on one of our common authors, Adam Smith. And I'm delighted that Branko actually alluded to this in his own remarks, because this goes back to that beggar sunning aside the road. So let me work up to this. I think we both certainly appreciate Smith's importance in the history of thinking about inequality. And I think we just differ on some details about Smith's attitude about inequality and the theory of moral sentiments. Branko thinks that Smith is more or less comfortable with inequality as we find it in theory of moral sentiments. He says that Smith accepts an immutable class structure that assumes people will often be equally happy, whether they're rich or poor. Which justifies, at least in Smith's mind, doing little or nothing about inequality. Now, in making this argument, Branko cites Smith's beggar, who suns himself by the side of the highway, who enjoys greater happiness than many kings, right? And certainly something that Smith says. But I'd like to press the case that this is not the definitive statement about Smith's attitude on inequality in the theory of moral sentiments either. Because while some beggars might enjoy a good sunning, Smith often depicts the life of the poor in this book as something much less pleasurable. Their lives are, rather, more often degrading. In particular, for the Scotsman, quote, "The poor man is ashamed of his poverty. He feels that it either places him out of the sight of mankind, or that if they take any notice of him, they are to have scarcely any fellow feeling with the misery and distress that he suffers." Indeed, the very beggars that Branko cites are portrayed by Smith earlier, on maybe the second or third page of Theory of Moral Sentiments, as wretches covered in sores and ulcers, whose misery is the object of the horror among their fellow citizens. The lives of most poor people are less about the simple pleasures of a good suntan than they are about the shame and misery accompanying significant inequality. And as Smith implies in this passage, this inequality deadens the sympathy the rich feel for the poor and fuels them with even greater contempt for the poor as a result. But all this is quibbling. I don't have any serious objections about Branko's book. It's a wonderful book. So let me just close with this. This may be the time to mention my father-in-law was an economist. He got his PhD in economics from University of Wisconsin, Madison in the 60s. And part of the requirements of getting a PhD in economics back in those days was 2 full semesters of the history of economic thought. Something that, I mean, I don't know if most PhD programs in economics even offer 2 classes in the history of economic thought anymore, much less require them. Um, and and what I learned, among the many things from reading Branko's wonderful book, was just how incredibly useful it would be for economists to have this background. And I think Branko's book would be a wonderful start in recovering this history to think about an issue that pretty much everybody agrees now is pretty important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we're moving over to another discussion of Branko's book, this one from Beatrice.
Okay, thanks for having me. So my connection is a bit unstable. So if you don't hear me well, cut me and then I'll cut off my camera with the hope that you hear me better. So I'm delighted to be here. I loved Branko's book. I'm a historian of 20th century economics, and I'm not just a historian of theory, but also a historian of practice and measurement and computation, and that's going to show in my comment. So the way I actually read Branko's book is that, so it's a long history of how some big figures have thought about inequality, so who gets what, basically, with chapter for Keynes, Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Pareto, and Kuznets, and something we all agree on is that you have this puzzle in the history of inequality, is why does that topic actually disappear from economists' mind, or at least get at the back of economics' mind during the Cold War, only to reappear some 20 years ago. So if you're a young scholar who actually listened to that, it's super interesting to say, okay, I want to study inequality. I need actually to know that it's not always a fashionable topic in the long and also 20th century of economics. How do you explain that? And as David just said, a lot of Branko's book is actually building up explanation for why it disappeared at some point. So before I go into that, one thing that is striking about Branko's book is also that it's normative, in the sense that Branko, you try to explain how big figures have thought about who gets what across centuries, but you also have an idea about what's a good way of thinking about inequality. And you're very clear about that. And that 3 things, you need to have a vision. As the title emphasized, you need to have a narrative of what drives inequality, an economically or politically motivating story. Then you need a theory. And I would even say a grand theory, because it needs to be integrative, in a sense that you don't just need to be a theory about how wealth inequality have changed in France or how wage inequality have changed in the US. It needs to be about inequality at large and the world at large. So it needs to be integrative. And third, you need some kind of empirical verification. And so what you do in the book is not just tracing the context in which these authors thought and what were their mostly theoretical thoughts, but also what empirical data they had at hand, but you also have a stance on whether these are useful visions of inequality, and part of your big claim is basically up to the early 20th century, these people have big visions of inequality because they were aware that they were evolving in sort of class system. Okay, and so they were actually bound to understand what the class system is about and what it does, and at some point it disappeared. And it disappeared somewhere in the 20th century, and especially at the beginning of the Cold War. And as David said, there is Pareto, who sort of naturalized inequality, and then you have a Kuznets, who basically says, well, inequality is going to increase with growth, but then at some point it's going to decrease with growth. So if you can get growth, you basically solve the issue as much as you can. And you also have empirical work that seems to suggest that inequality, like functional inequality, how much do capital versus labor get, is actually stable, and so there is not much to do about it. And so your big claim is that it disappeared at some point, which is really interesting. So and you have that such sort of like long last chapter about inequality vanishing from, not so much inequality research vanishing from economics work, but useful inequality work vanishing from economic world in the Cold War. So one thing I think that stands out as the historian. There are lots of histories of inequality. One thing that is wonderful in the book, you are the only scholar who can pull that out, is that it's not much about how inequality disappears from scholarship in the US or even in the Western world. You have that comparison between how inequality is being thought and even how whether data is accumulated or not in capitalist Western world versus in Russia and other socialist state versus China. And this is super original. So you show stuff that we know about. So the ideological context is that basically you have a market society in the US and in Europe, and it's supposed to be meritocratic and to work well. And so these people, the society actually believe they have solved the problem with unfair inequality. Okay, but you also say, well, in Russia, actually, you need to understand that somehow public ownership of capital in Russia has been consistent with the idea of somehow high inequality, and also you're not supposed to gather data. Okay, so you actually don't know, but in Yugoslavia and Poland, it's less so, and so you do have surveys, and you have sort of a different way of thinking about that, while in China, actually, Chinese socialism is very different because it doesn't allow. It has a narrative that doesn't really allow for types of inequality. It's somehow anti-meritocratic, or it's a completely different type of system. And that's the first time I actually read that. That's again, I can understand where it comes in terms of your background, and that's like wonderful to and super original to read. Now, two things we can debate. You also spend a lot of time saying that inequality has disappeared as a topic because of the change in economics at the time. So we discussed a bit about theory. You can do much more. I guess one of the big things in the post-war is that normative and positive economics actually separate. So you're not supposed to think about not just inequality, but these issues at large. And you have models that are about efficiency, and you have models that are about distribution, and these are not the same thing. Okay, so there is a lot going on about welfare economics, as John has actually said, like the end of interpersonal comparisons of utility at the beginning. One is that then there is a fragmentation of the discipline, and then development economics. And so you seem to say development economics, except Samir Amin and a few other, lacks perspective, and especially perspective on world inequality at the time. So it has a, like, worldly, this is a compliment, like worldly philosopher by Heilbronner tone. So you seem to regret an end of a way to think about inequality in economics. Two things: I think you're not only fair or always fair or fully documented. You say, for instance, Atkinson has a very narrow empirical view of inequality. There is much more to do here. So there's someone that actually accumulates data, someone who also actually contributes to optimal taxation theory, and that's the way to think about distribution. So there is theory, there is also some specific focus, like on the elderly at that time. Same with all the research that is actually, it's not that inequality disappear. It's some types of inequality are not studied anymore, and other types become more fashionable. And one type of inequality that is being studied is wage inequality, okay? But it's not just about labor. It's also about discrimination. It's also about race inequality. It's also about gender inequality. So the whole ideological context is different. And if you're someone listening around, there is a lot of research to do about that, to understand that. And my last point and my biggest point is you said a useful theory, a useful vision of inequality also have an empirical side. And so you intersect, so you give evidence of what Marx and Kenne and Smith and others were thinking, and how inequality was back then at different times, what types of inequality was rising, and so forth. But these people, they did not have that apparatus at that time. So even if this were the transformation, they probably wouldn't have been fully aware of this. And that raised a big issue is the history of measurement. So you say you need to have some empirical validation, but empirical data back in the 19th century and also in the 20th century, they don't exist out there. And most histories of inequality, they are just concerned with the 20th century, like by Alasevich and Sochi and Dan Hirschman and Nima Padipati and Pedro Ramos Pinto. They emphasize a lot measurement, and I think that's really interesting to bring this perspective into conversation with yours, because I mean, if you study who gets what, actually defining who is like super hard. Is it a household? Is it an individual? Do you have concept of household in Europe, in France and Britain, that actually translate in Nigeria? Is it completely different? Also, like centuries of thinking about how you define and you measure what. I mean, is it money? Is it grain? Is it wages? Is it bequest? What is it about? Okay, and you have also huge debate. So if really that's a useful vision of inequality as something that is both theoretical and empirical, there is a whole history of measuring inequality that you want to bring into the picture. We can talk about this more after. That's it.
Hey, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for all those presentations. We're going to have a general discussion now, and I'll try and lead it off by actually following on from something Beatrice raised there. This question of why wasn't inequality studied more extensively until recently? Again, going back to something I said a little earlier, Wendy reminded me there'll be a lot of people watching this webcast who actually weren't born in the 1980s. So I thought perhaps I'd just remind people what it was like there. I studied economics in Oxford from 81 to 84, and then I went to Harvard and spent a year in the economics PhD program there. And I guess that was the height of sort of rational expectations theory and sort of high general equilibrium theory, as Branko refers to it. And really, I mean, it wasn't that inequality and didn't exist. It still existed. I mean, I remember in Oxford sort of, blowing my head up trying to write an essay or something on various measures of inequality, Tony Atkinson's measure versus entropy theories, tiles theory, there are a whole bunch of them, some of them very complicated mathematically, but that was very much seen as a sort of technical discussion. And I don't remember it being linked to sort of broader policy questions, apart from in development economics, which I think is where a lot of these measures came from, but I didn't study that, so I can't speak to that. But certainly in the sort of mainstream micro, macro policy, monetary policy, etc., which is what I did, and economic history too, you didn't really get extensive discussions or really any discussions of sort of economic inequality, apart from the question of sort of factor shares in labor economics. And the way inequality was dealt with there, going back to sort of Cambridge School, was, you had a bit of sort of heterogeneity because you had two classes and there was a savings rate. The capitalists didn't save, so there was a bit of heterogeneity there, and that sort of drove a lot of the macroeconomic outcomes. But there really wasn't any extensive discussion of inequality. And then I went to Harvard and did the PhD sort of boot camp year, and I was only an auditor, so I didn't do all the math, but I sat through a lot of it. And I think apart from sort of discussions of whether the Solo model is consistent with sort of conditional convergence, I don't remember any real discussion of inequality, and absolutely no discussion whatsoever of economic history or economic or the history of economic thought. At that point, Harvard and MIT did still have a requirement to do either one class in economic history or one class in on the history of economic thought. I think subsequently, because of the sort of math demands, etc., even though, Anna, maybe correct me on this, but I think those requirements have disappeared. So I'd just like to, from that point, there's basically no inequality. But then it turns out the last 20 years of my life, I spent a great deal of my time writing about inequality as a story. So I'd just like to ask the other panelists, and Branko, of course, has got a whole theory about this in his book, and I'd be very interested in David's sort of philosophical view, because when I was at Harvard, if you wanted to study inequality, you basically went to Rawls's class on the theory of justice, with all sort of 500 other students. So inequality was obviously still a huge subject in philosophy at the time, even as it disappeared somewhat from economics. But I'd just like to open up the debate and ask people to really give what's their theory of why it disappeared to some extent, although, as Beatrice explained, there was still a lot of technical work going on, and then came back. Was it the Cold War? Was it the actual rise of inequality in Piketty's curve? Was it ideological developments? What's your take? Maybe, David, you could start with a philosophical take on it.
Sure. Thanks, John. Yeah, it's certainly academic interests often tend to follow real world events. So, within the discipline of political science where I'm stationed, um, you know, there was a tremendous amount of political science, for example, um, in the 50s through the 80s about nuclear weapons strategy, right? How you want to build them, where you want to put them, how you might reduce them, right? And I don't know if that gets taught much in political science anymore. Not that there aren't nuclear weapons, but after the Cold War, at least as we understood it back in the good old days, it seems to be less about that particular fear than other fears. Another example is American political scientists spent very little time thinking about authoritarianism until fairly recently, right? Lots of studies about why people in Congress vote one way or the other, but less focus on how would the system function under an authoritarian ruler? Well, now political scientists are scrambling and trying to make sense of current developments, and I think much the same is true of inequality. And you're certainly right. You do note that Rawls is somebody who addresses inequality in this period that some people have called the Great Compression, right? He developed his theory of his two principles of justice, including the difference principle, which says that any improvement on behalf of the richest people should be accompanied by some at least moderate increase for the poorest. But Rawls is really mostly the exception to this, right? Political theorists were not really thinking about these kinds of questions. I mean, a lot of this period is consumed by the so-called Straussian political philosophers interested in various esoteric issues. But obviously, I think the thing that got the attention of political scientists and political theorists, especially, was, of course, the housing market collapse in 2008 that really drew people to this issue. And then, of course, Occupy Wall Street in the aftermath of that, that really focused people's interests on these matters. And that was certainly true for me as well, right? And it wasn't that inequality didn't exist before, but it became increasingly, well, as it grew, which it certainly did for an extended period of time, and became more tangible in the political environment, the more it started demanding academic attention.
Okay, thanks very much. Maybe, Anna, you could give us a perspective of somebody that was teaching now and went through the system a generation after me, anyway.
Sorry, I didn't hear that, John. Would you mind repeating?
But just to give us perspective on you on how inequality was dealt with when you were doing your sort of graduate training or whatever, and how things have changed, and what you think has driven the changes.
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting, John, because my experience is quite similar to yours, despite the being more recent. So I did my undergraduate at Cambridge in economics in 2010 to 13, and attention to inequality was even then very limited in the academic curriculum, despite being much more prominent now in the academic economic research world, as we've heard. And I remember a triple hammer blow to the idea that we should be studying inequality normatively, which we've talked about several times in this conversation, but just to kind of emphasize the concept of Pareto optimum being one that bakes in automatically initial distributions of endowments or wealth or wherever you were to begin with. The first and second welfare theorem, where the second welfare theorem tells us that you could achieve whatever end distribution you want to through a competitive equilibrium, but you might need to redistribute the endowments in the first place, but we don't talk about that part. And then the concept of Kaldor-Hicks efficiency, where the idea was you could, as Beatrice talked about, separate the kind of positive or descriptive goal of achieving total maximization of economic efficiency from the normative and inherently political and inherently ethical question of how to achieve that distribution, and that Kaldor-Hicks efficiency was going to be the criteria on which we would normally judge an economic policy as an economist, and then we leave it to the politicians and everyone else to figure out the distributional piece. And that was still very much the animating ethos of my undergraduate education, with the strange kind of exception and conflict to the idea that we use a utilitarian social welfare function to actually evaluate the welfare effects of policies, where the inequality is intrinsically baked in because you have diminishing marginal returns to income or wealth in these social welfare functions. So we had this disconnect, but mostly weren't thinking about inequality. And that was strange as a student, because this was the time of the global financial crisis and the aftermath. And so there was a lot of interest and desire and demand. People were going to the Occupy protests at the weekends and then not seeing the connection between how we were studying the world. In my graduate school education at Harvard, there had become more attention to inequality. I think this was primarily still study on wage inequality, but also increased attention to the functional distribution of income. And that was animated by the wave of, obviously the work we've talked about, Piketty and Sayers, but also the wave of work coming out in the mid-2010s, early 2010s, finding declines in the labor share across the world. And that was a stark contrast to what people had thought of as the Kaldor facts, including that the labor share and capital share were constant. And so this is not an object that we're particularly interested in understanding. So that very rapid shift for me happened, at least on the being educated side of economics, in the mid-2010s.
Right. And is it reflected in the curriculums now? In the sort of core courses?
I think so. So there's no... as far as I know, there was certainly no history of economic thought or economic history requirement when I was doing my PhD at Harvard, and I don't think that's true in many programs that I know of. But nowadays, inequality is definitely centrally taught from an empirical perspective. If you're studying labor or macro, you'll study things about the labor and capital share, and you'll study things about the distribution of wages. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Branko, Beatrice mentioned your theory of the sort of Cold War, the grand theory.
Well, we could, of course, talk about that for a long time. The chapter 7 is the most controversial chapter because it is really, it's called the eclipse. And there is an eclipse in studies of inequality. There is a reason why I started the chapter, Beatrice mentioned them, with study of inequality under socialist countries. It's absolutely crucial to understand why there was no study of inequality in capitalist countries. The reason is the following. When you have a socialist country, the way that inequality had been historically studied is between the owners of capital and owners of labor power. Once you have nationalized capital, you don't have capitalist class anymore. So you are actually sitting with best intentions to study inequality, but your subject has changed because there is no capitalist. Everybody is a laborer. Everybody works for the state companies. You can study wage inequality, and there were numerous studies of wage inequality, as many as in the West. The problem that the Western economies don't know they exist, it's their problem, but the studies were multiple. And of course, they established that there was very low difference between manual labor and highly skilled labor, all the stuff that we know, low returns to education, all that. Now, why is it important for capitalist economies? Because with the Cold War, three things have happened simultaneously and independently large. The first one, US, which actually always had much less of a class structure than Europe, said, look, you say in the Soviet Union you have no classes. We don't have classes either. It's finished. We have actually agents. The agents have subscripts. Your subscript is K, my subscript is L, yours is I, mine is J. It's all the same. We optimize under the conditions of scarcity. What you have as an endowment is your problem. What I have the endowment is my problem. There is no issue of class anymore. So class is gone. Well, when class is gone, the endowments in the general equilibrium model appear from the outside. And that's where the big difference between Smith and general equilibrium is. If you read Wealth of Nations, you read pages of how wealth was acquired. Similarly to Marx, primitive accumulation. In Smith, actually, I think the primitive accumulation is even stronger, it's even worse than in Marx. But if you decide also to eliminate how the wealth was acquired, it's not your topic, because what you need to know is that there is a guy with wealth and he comes to the general equilibrium, and that wealth generates an income, which is marginal productivity and all nice stories of John Clark Bates. That's end of the story. So think of the following fact. You have first eliminated classes, then you have totally eliminated acquisition of wealth. So how are you going to study inequality? You're not going to study inequality, and that's why inequality was not studied. And then you have, of course, funding by the rich who don't like the study of inequality. So what the study of inequality became was the study of what I call incidental studies of inequality, where actually I have to include wage inequality. Why do I include wage inequality? It's not that this is not important area, and wages represent 70% of market income and so forth. The point is that the transmission of inequality and the advantages that come with it takes place through families and households. And if you do not know how households are being created, because the wage distribution is a wage distribution across wage earners, you really cannot tell what will be the long or medium-term effects of inequality. So you need households. Going back to Beatrice's problem, it is really a problem also of measurement, because a household in Norway, which is composed of 1.2 person on average, is not the same as household in Mali, which is composed of 9 people. So there are many issues of that kind, but as I was saying before, let me just summarize. There are 3 main reasons. The first one, elimination of classes from the study. Second one, elimination of the ways of how wealth is acquired. And the third one, funding of the studies by the rich. So if you have all these 3 things, why should you study inequality? On top of that, you had a decline of inequality in most of the Western countries, which made it even less interesting, because it was felt it is something that is actually going to be less and less relevant. And that's why you find in textbooks, I actually quote obviously the famous Samuelson textbook, where he talks a lot about factor shares and all of that, but he doesn't mention inequality until the last chapters where he deals with less developed countries. And then you say, wow, this is like the only place in the world where inequality is a problem. It's nowhere else. That's where he introduces actually the Gini coefficient, the Lorentz curve, everything comes with development economics. So that's actually, in my opinion, why inequality studies in the Western capitalist countries became just totally, how should I say, they did exist because empirical work did exist, but they were totally of the secondary or even tertiary importance in studies.
Can I just press you on that a bit, Branko? Mm-hmm. I mean, some of what I read your chapter, fascinating chapter. I mean, a lot of it reminded me of Joan Robinson making the arguments in the 1950s about the nature of neoclassical economics. Yeah. And Joan Robinson, of course, invented, I don't know if she invented it, but she formalized monopsony, which was rediscovered sort of 70 years after her death. But she turned violently against neoclassical economics in the 1950s and actually saw it, basically made the argument that it existed to prop up the sort of American imperialist capitalist system. And she referred to Cold War economics, that the primary role of neoclassical economics and Samuelson, Solow and all those guys, even though they themselves were well-meaning, their functional role in the system was basically to prop it up. Is that your view too?
Well, maybe I would not put it as crudely, because what they said, I think there were endogenous developments in general equilibrium that could not handle the acquisition of wealth. So it is true that they just could not handle it because the model was not supposed to do that. But it is true that they didn't want to study that. They wanted to ignore it. And actually, this is a very sharp departure from Smith and Marx, where you do actually study how people have become rich and how some people are not rich. It is important stuff. I would not say, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe you take also John Robinson a little bit sort of in an extreme way, but I would not say that it's all entirely political, but I would say that the political elements did play a role. And after all, it's not accidental that income distribution comes back with two developments: end of the Cold War, end of communism, that's one development, and the second development is the Great Recession. So it clearly came because there was a significant change, both politically and economically.
Right, right. But there were internal developments in the subject, as you said. Okay, Beatrice.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to add something in between. Like, as Branko say, you get the big reason, the funding, the ideology, the end of classes, but still you want to understand how you go from there to papers after papers after papers and class after class and textbook after textbook. Economists just sees, that's not just intentional. So you want to understand the aggregation of that. And so the idea is that if you're a researcher in post-war America, if you're an economist in post-war America, basically you're being told that growth is going to sort stuff up. You have a fiscal system in which the top marginal tax share is still 90% or 80%, and you don't know if it's working or not. Now it's being debated, but at that time, you think it's going to take care of the inequality issue. You're constantly being told that the number one world issue, and also inside the country, is poverty. So there is also an agreement among historians of economics that you can't have like 10 big issues. And so poverty in this year is sort of crowding out inequality. I mean, the World Bank is hiring people to work in poverty and so forth. Just like Anna says, it's already being the case in the 60s and 70s. If you write paper and you're basically allowed to say, I'm going to study the efficiency of this mechanism, footnote, there is a second theorem of welfare economics that allows this Pareto optimality to be decentralized. And I'm not going to do this in this paper. And you have this after paper after paper. So again, it's not intentional. You're not pushing inequality out, except for a few researchers that are clearly ideological. And on top of that, going back to measurement, you lose the data. There is a fantastic paper by sociologist Dan Hirschman about the 1%. I mean, one big question is like what you can see first and foremost as an economist. And the question is, how do we miss the rise at the top, the wealth and income inequality at the top? And it's going to tell you, well, first, these data are top coded, so it's very hard to know. And then if no one asked for them, because everyone asked for wages data in the 70s, some series produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics on income and wealth, they're just being defunded. So you're losing your glasses. This is really important. And then you have to wait 15 years, and then Paul Krugman that makes a column on isn't equality rising again? And then people at MIT like Poterba and his PhD students, Emmanuel says, trying to rebuild some data, and then Piketty trying to rebuild some data in France. It takes time to see things again. And that's the accumulation of all this that actually, so I just want to emphasize that it's also accidental and sort of aggregation of like research decision, because if we are scientists, we want to pay attention to keeping our glasses and keeping our diversity and that kind of stuff.
Okay, great. I mean, I'd like to throw that one open to the other panelists, this question of what the role of data collection and data analysis played in the sort of development of thinking about inequality. I mean, ultimately, data aggregation, is a government, in most places, is a government-run operation. I mean, if we think of Keynesianism, it's very difficult to think how Keynesianism could have developed we're at the Stone Center here, without the development of national income and accounting, which was a government initiative during the 1930s, and especially during the Second World War, because they wanted to manage the economy, so you need some aggregates, and they came up with the social income accounting. So, I mean, at some point, these sort of consumer surveys, which a lot of the World Bank, et cetera, were working on, could have been commissioned earlier. And I just wonder, from your perspective as economists working in the field, and sorry, David, this doesn't apply to you, but certainly comment if you want to, how the sort of development of data, and especially you, Branko, because you're at the World Bank, how that fed into your thinking about inequality.
John, very briefly, I've been working with the service. That's why I actually got the job in the World Bank, because I was working with Yugoslav service. That was my dissertation. So the service did exist. Actually, in most Western countries, they started in the 1960s. In many, started in the 1950s. So the service did exist, and of course, in either like less developed, in East European countries, they start also around 60s. In India, they started in 1952. In China, they have service in the 50s, then they have big interruption because of the Cultural Revolution. So this, and Africa did not. And actually, Latin America, Brazilian service go into 60s. So there were data. Now, the data were not as accessible as they are now, simply because we have computers and it was much more difficult and so on. But there was an element, and actually Beatrice mentioned that, there was an element of non-sexiness of the topic. And the non-sexiness of the topic comes from the ideological approach which exists. And there you have students who come. Well, students are not going to study something that nobody is interested in, and we're not going to get a job. So they study what their teachers teach them and tell them. So I don't think actually there is an accidental element, but above that accidental element, there is an ideological element. So the two of them work, and then there is an incentive element of young people, and they say, okay, well, why should we study that? You know, we are not going to get jobs where there are no data, nobody is teaching us, so it just disappears as a topic. Now, as I said before, it doesn't disappear fully, because there are people like Atkinson, James Mead, Nickel Wright, Nolan. There were many people who were working, and actually also sociologists. But I was saying I did not see them as deriving what they called, what Beatrice mentioned, integrative theories.
Right. So, I mean, at the World Bank, when you were starting out, what the data was already all there, or I mean, what was the
I'm actually playing problem with the light here, but the data was already there. But the data, again, I think Beatrice mentioned, you mentioned that there was a trade-off between poverty and inequality. You were supposed to study poverty. I tell you now, I'm telling now the real names, because for a long time I didn't want, but when I went to Carnegie Endowment, Jessica Matthews, who was actually a great person who actually I admire a lot, but when she had to raise money for Carnegie, and I had all these articles where inequality was, in every second article, there was a title of inequality. Jessica says to me, like, why do you have all this inequality stuff? Just replace inequality and call it poverty, because when I have to raise money, nobody's going to, these rich people don't want to see the world inequality. Just change it. It's all the same. So that was the approach then. That was actually, I was there in 2003, 2005. That was the approach then. And the World Bank itself, of course, studied only poverty. It was really rather by accident that I was in that unit. And then I said to myself, look, we have all this data. Why can't we study global inequality? And of course, François Bourguignon and Christian Morisson did the same thing over much longer time, exactly the same year. So there was a trade-off between the two.
It wasn't at the World Bank. It wasn't a top-down initiative. It wasn't like a World
No,
Bank.
it was not the top-down. It just, you decide, well, there are data here. Why don't I study global inequality? There was nothing, top-down.
Okay, thank you. Anna, maybe you give us your perspective on the sort of importance of data.
Yeah, I think there are two recent aspects that are interesting in the illustrations on that. One is that one of the big dynamics in the rise of top income inequality in the last 20 years or so is the rise of mixed income, mixed capital and labor income. And I know Branko's written about that a lot. And that's been homoplutia, exactly, very interesting, because the development, the sort of data infrastructure thinking about factor shares was not really set up to think about the rise of very, very high labor earners who also got capital income, or people who were very, very managing very successful, wealthy businesses and owning them at the same time. And so our data and also our theory had to then catch up to this other trend. And I think that sort of slowed our understanding, or we tried to put the rise in top incomes into a box that was historical rather than understanding it in a present box, in part because the data wasn't there initially and it was hard to disentangle capital from labor income.
Right. So what was the key development there? The Treasury giving people tax data, or what was?
Yeah, I mean, others can speak to this as well. I think it was partly better access to detailed tax data where you could really disentangle who was earning what kinds of income and where. So like in the US, that would be thinking about things like pass-through entities, S corps, partnerships, and what kinds of industries these people were in. And so you have these papers thinking about, a lot of the top 1% is dentists that run their own dental studios, or people that manage a chain of successful auto dealerships, and being able to get the granularity of who this new elite class is, and disaggregating from just the capital labor dichotomy.
Beatrice, would you like to?
I actually just forgot the point I was going to make, so we can move on.
Carry on. No? Okay, we'll move on to Beatrice then. Would you like to comment on this data and Branko's?
I have a follow-up. I think David actually want to talk, and then I have a follow-up question on the sexiness of some topics to Branko and Anna. But maybe David can, if that's something.
Yeah, sure. David?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not the data guy here. So let me make a broader point here. I mean, certainly, I mean, I'm well aware of the fact that the data has gotten much better on being able to measure things like poverty and inequality over the last few decades. But I think it's notable, right, that people were concerned a lot about inequality before, they, even had a notion of what data was, right? I mean, Plato was deeply concerned about inequality. So the question then is, for me at least, in my research in the history of political thought, is how did people know that there was inequality, and especially a deeply problematic inequality, without data, right? And this is where we look to these figures from the past and see, what signs they found, what signals they found in society that indicated that there was a problem in society emanating from this growing division of classes, right? And this is where we looked at things like indifference to the poor, right? As just an example, right? There's a wonderful passage in Tocqueville's Democracy in America, right? And Tocqueville has complex feelings about democracy, but he's at one point he quotes a French aristocrat who's writing a letter to a friend and saying, "Oh, out in the courtyard, I see they're torturing somebody. How lovely! Now let me tell you about my flowers I've been growing in my garden." Right? Tocqueville is so struck by how somebody could have no feeling for someone who was significantly poorer than her. And this struck him as a very regrettable fact about the deep and entrenched inequality he found in France in particular, but in much of in Europe at the time in the 19th century. Right. So that's just one example of things we might notice that would be signs of great inequality. Of course, for Plato, and not irrelevant to us now, one of the great signs of inequality is the receptiveness of people to demagogues, right? People who are poor and feel structurally excluded in society look for a champion who can dish it out to the elites. Certainly the wealthy, but maybe associated, political and intellectual elites as well, right? Not irrelevant to our own time. So I want to say a little bit about that, how people thought about inequality before there was data. And secondly, there were a couple of references about the distinction between poverty and inequality. And how, of course, Branko was very right to notice, other people have noticed as well, that while there's lots of people who are happy to talk about poverty being a problem these days, they often want to draw a line and say, well, poverty is a problem. That's something that we have some obligation to do something about. Inequality, on the other hand, is not a problem in a non-zero-sum economy, right, where aggregate societal wealth is growing, right? And as long as the material standing of the poorest people are raised to some degree, right, we ought not to worry about the gap between the poorest and the richest, right? And one of the things that I argue throughout my book is that while, of course, every philosopher that I discuss is very concerned about poverty, this is not to the exclusion of inequality, right? Branko and I both quote a passage in our discussion of Marx where Marx describes this person who lives in a house next door to somebody with a reasonable house next door. But then that neighbor gets very rich, right? Through various means, and the next door neighbor's house becomes a palace. And even though the person living next door is living in the same house, that palace, he says, now feels like a hovel, right? And it's not that the material circumstances have gotten worse for the poor, but the psychological condition of the poor, their feeling of self-worth, their dignity, and the extent to which they feel they matter in society has dramatically declined and affected their well-being. So I want to draw attention to that as well.
Okay, thank you. Beatrice, did you have another comment on the data?
Yeah, I both want to build on that, the idea of data science and that kind of like sexiness of topic, because it's also a question of data as aesthetics. So I understand, Branko, I'm not trying to shed away that ideology is a big cause, but the thing is that the ideology is hanging there, and I'm trying to operationalize that and to translate it into the daily lives of scientists and economists. And then, of course, there is a question: how do you reverse the trend? And it's not just about like finding more data as science. I think there is also, I want to throw in the importance of visuals, and it's not just a very recent thing. I mean, you can think of Maria and Otto Neurath on pictograms, or Dubois on race visuals in the 20s and things like that. And that's a question I always wanted to ask Branko. There is the elephant curve. It's not just the research, yet there is one big visuals. When I teach the history of quantification to my students, I have a lot, and that actually ends, the most recent visuals has there is the elephant curve. And I wanted to ask you, do you feel, is it on purpose? Is it articulated? And do you feel that kind of visualization of data or visualization of research on inequality, and you have a lot of that game on inequality research recently, which is why I ask about it, can actually make a topic sexy again, or can place that kind of topic of inequality back onto the public scene, since you've participated to that very efficiently? What's the game here?
No, I think the topic has been moved to the public scene. That's why we are actually talking about it now. But I think it was moved for the reasons that I mentioned. There was an ideological change, and there was actually the Great Recession. So I think these were the reasons. And then there is populism and all of that. I do agree, obviously, that the great advantage of the elephant curve was that it was in a single graph. It basically displayed essentially, how should I say, the alternative, two political alternatives, two ways to decide whether you would, particularly rich countries and particularly United States, whether the emphasis should be in derailing globalization and essentially screwing China, or should be redistribution from the top to the middle classes. So that was like the story of that elephant chart in terms of political and economic policy. And it is a striking chart, I agree. You know, the chart has changed since, because there are many things have changed in the meantime, so I will not go over that. And don't forget one thing, as China and India and others go up the chart, the very position of the deciles and percentiles of these countries is changing. So they're no longer around the 50th percentile, they're now at the 60th, 65th percentile. So even if everything behind the chart were to stay the same, the visualization of the chart would be different.
Okay, thank you. I would just say, as a journalist, I mean, I think, Beatrice, you're exactly right. The ease with which you can visualize these complicated stories has been enormously influential. I mean, in my book, which is a popular history of critiques of capitalism, I only have two charts, and one of them is the hockey stick.
Yes.
And the other one is Branko's elephant curve.
Yeah.
I should have probably also put in Piketty's U-shaped curve of inequality in the 20th century. But I mean, I think those three charts have been enormously influential in turning these debates into public debates. Just one other thing on Branko, just to amplify one thing Branko said about how a lot of the data was there and was sort of hidden, or was hidden in plain sight. I mean, one of the things I learned when writing my book, when I read a chapter about Marx, was actually there's a data exercise in his most famous chapter on general theory of capitalist accumulation, where he lays out theories, but then nobody ever writes about it, but probably nobody ever reads it. But if you look at the sort of second half of the chapter, there's a long discussion of income inequality in Victorian Britain, in which he actually goes and looks at the tax data and has a sort of table, which in some ways reminded me of the sort of Piketty-Sayers charts, showing how the top 500 families or whatever in the UK earned, X hundred times from their capital income the average income of a regular person. So, I mean, the data, Marx could find that data in the British Library or whatever the hell he got it. So there has been data out there for people who wanted to.
I mean, the last page of my chapter on Marx, page 160, is fiscal data from Ireland and England that he puts together. He gives them, and I took them, and you get a Pareto line. This is the same data that Pareto had, same type of data that Pareto used 30 years later to create the power law and to draw the Pareto line. So it is, if Marx had taken this data and put them in the double log form, he would have had a Pareto line, but he didn't. But the data are there. So actually, you were right. I mean, most people don't read Marx, and my problem with presenting the book was that originally, when I wrote the chapter on Marx, I organized with Twitter 9 or 11 conversations only with Marx specialists, because I wanted to be sure that they agree more or less with my interpretation. But when I do these presentations like randomly to economists, people all nod. They say, okay, that seems good, because nobody has read Marx. So whatever we tell them seems like reasonable. You're not telling something which is totally wild. They all agree. And actually, they don't know that Marx has actually enormous amount of data. And of course, Smith has the data. Quesnay has the data. Quesnay has, of course, the tableau économique, and then he has the grand tableau économique, where he has the data which he believes are more actually reflecting the French economy. So people were trying to have the data, and so the data were always an integral part of income inequality.
Right. Okay, thanks very much. We've got about 10 minutes left. So I'd like to sort of broaden out the discussion a bit. As I said, we've had this sort of 20, 25 years of intense discussions of inequality, both in the popular press, but also in academia, burgeoning research in all sorts of areas. So I'd just like the panelists to maybe look forward a bit on how where does inequality research and thinking about inequality go from here? Do we need to broaden the lens to, from economic inequality to other types of inequality? Gender inequality, racial inequality, regional inequality. Where do things go from here? What's missing in the current discussions of inequality? And we go straight across the thing. Maybe Beatrice, you could start on that one.
So I'm not an inequality researcher. So what I have to say is more not on the type of data, but really on continuing on that idea that you want theoretical framework in economic profession and data infrastructure that are robust to ideology, funding, and political shock. And we know how much this is a challenge right now, especially, well, not just especially in America, like everywhere, basically. And sort of like infrastructure, like intellectual and technical and data and the infrastructure that preserve non-fashionable questions in stuff that you don't know yet what to do with, basically. So I cannot tell you go more into gender or whatever, but if there are some takeaways, as that whole scholarship can disappear, because you just stop asking the right question and you just not looking at the right stuff, or you're looking at the data, and we can probably improve on that.
Right. Okay. David, do you have a perspective on this one? Where having written a book on the history of inequality, is there a gap there anywhere which you think should be filled?
Well, sure. There's lots of gaps in the history still that need to be filled, and um, I'm doing some work on that now. I'm working on a paper right now, for example, on Frederick Douglass and his thoughts on economic inequality, which are not very well known. Obviously, a lot of people know his thoughts about racial inequality. But fascinatingly, Frederick Douglass read a lot of the same source material that I discuss in my book, certainly including Plutarch's Lives, when he discusses inequality in ancient Sparta and Rome, discussing the lawgivers Lycurgus and Solon. And he looks to this as an inspiration, right? That Western civilization, broadly conceived, has thought that inequality is deeply problematic, right? So maybe that's something that the Western civilization should still consider problematic, both along racial, economic and racial lines. And I'm exploring how Frederick Douglass makes those connections. But I think moving into the future, right, as we think about how inequality is evolving in our own time, I think something for scholars to be thinking about is the interrelationship between inequality and political instability as we're experiencing now. What is the role of inequality in some of the instability of political institutions as we're experiencing? And why is inequality experienced maybe differently in places like Russia versus the United States, right? Does the United States having a history of more stable democratic institutions and norms give us a better fighting chance against authoritarianism and deep, encroaching political problems? Or maybe that leaves us unprepared to deal with this as we continue to experience enormous inequality on the precipice of some very serious, as we're experiencing right now, literally down the street from me, some very serious political instability and authoritarian measures. So these are things certainly that political scientists and political theorists are thinking about, and will need to be thinking about more in the coming decade or so.
Okay, thank you. Anna, do you have any thoughts on where we should take study of inequality?
Yeah, absolutely. I have 4 buckets of thoughts. The first is on, we made a lot of progress about studying the what of inequality, but I want to focus also on how we study inequality. This has changed a lot over recent years, and I've seen this in my career. So, for example, in areas that I've worked, labor income inequality and the labor share particularly, in earlier research, there was a lot more emphasis on what you might call impersonal market forces as the drivers for the change: technological change and automation, globalization, changes in skill returns, superstar economics. And over recent years, we've seen economics focus a lot more on topics that sociology has focused on for a long time, and institutionalist economics and political economy before that, power, politics, things like unions and organizations, collective organizations, social norms. And I think those hows of why inequality has emerged, bringing those topics back in, centering them, thinking about new ways we can study them within economics is crucial. The second is thinking about the who. And reading both David's and Branko's book, I thought it was fascinating to see how each scholar over time conceived of what the relevant divides were in inequality. Was it rich and poor? Was it capital and labor, or landowners? Was it the elite and the rest? I'm not sure we have the right vocabulary or categorization yet to describe the inequality that we have today. I mean, the top 1% and the rest is one, contender. Capital and labor being back is another one. High and low skill labor, quote unquote, is another. But I'm not sure any of them fully describe the core cleavages about which of the groups with sort of the same forces acting on their benefit versus detriment and the same interests, and how does that shape inequality. The third is about why it matters, what inequality does. And I think this is what the thinkers in David's book talk so much about, is the consequences of inequality. And I think the study in economics of inequality so far is largely about measurement and about causes. And I think we could do a lot more to study the consequences on our social and political systems, in particular on individuals' welfare and the psychological aspects of inequality. And I think that's particularly interesting because it sort of ties back to my first point right at the beginning about a lot of these early scholars cared about inequality in part because they saw the economy as zero sum in terms of wealth. And so a rich person being richer would mean a poor person gets poorer. That's not necessarily true today, but there's a lot of other things that are zero sum where inequality matters a lot, like power or influence. And so a rich person getting richer might mean they have more power, and that is at the detriment of someone else. And so thinking about the consequences on these sort of more zero-sum social outcomes seems really first-order important. And the final point I'll make is who is actually studying inequality. So most of my work is on labor market topics, as we've talked about, but I have also worked on trying to study who actually is an economist. And the economics profession is remarkably non-socioeconomically diverse. This is true in the US, and I believe it's also true in the UK from other work, and perhaps in other countries too. Much less, by the way, than sociology or political science. That may be no coincidence. But if you look, for example, at the people who are getting their PhDs now at the top US institutions, about 12% are first-gen college grads. You've got more people who got degrees from Ivy Plus undergrad schools, that's 12 schools, than you have degrees from any US publicly funded public institution. You've got a remarkable concentration in economics of people from the elites going on to study. And I came from a prestigious undergrad. I came from a relatively well-to-do family. I'm including myself in that bucket. But I don't think we can really hope to study inequality well without having much better representation of people who it affects.
Fascinating, thank you. And Branko, do you have any big thoughts on where we should go from here? Or small thoughts?
No, but I have, in the epilogue of my book, I'm quite optimistic. And I'm optimistic for three reasons. First of all, because inequality is a big topic now, and it's actually not going down, more or less, actually. So for the students of inequality, it is good that inequality is high, okay? That's kind of obvious. Now, why I'm optimistic? I first think that actually Piketty's contribution was very important because he brought two things back. He brought capital back, and he brought combination of political and economic studies together. And that was, I think, quite important. Secondly, I think that we now have really significant expansion of historical knowledge on inequality using social tables. I'm actually very much involved in that. 19th century, 18th century, we actually have social table for Athens, year 400 BC. We have Roman Empire. I did it for Byzantium. You know, we have Mesopotamia. We are actually learning so much. I'm not saying these are like impeccable sources, but they are reasonable sources. And the third thing is like a sort of, what is this, blowing in my own trumpet. I think working on a global scale makes you really move and see inequality differently because you're moving like from two-dimensional to three-dimensional. Once you move to the global scale, many of the things that we discuss within nation state become seen differently. Even the question, for example, what Anna mentioned, like sort of satisfactory income and all of that, it is actually seen very differently globally. When you see that, for example, the bottom of Italian income distribution declines very significantly globally because of the rise of Asia. So you actually have an entirely different story of the world. And that, I think, is the third area on which I feel very optimistic.
Okay. Does anybody else have anything to add on that? I think we've pretty much exhausted our time. Thanks, everybody. I mean, Wendy asked me to say something briefly at the end. I mean, I thought it was a fascinating discussion. It just seems to me that just as somebody who's lived for 30 years on the sort of intersection of academia and journalism, things are just much more interesting than they used to be. Economics is a more interesting subject than it used to be. And the way I see it is it's sort of political economy reborn. A lot of the writers in both of these books describe themselves as political economists, not economists. And I think, you know, what happened in 20th century is basically classical economics, and the sort of classical perspective on things was just thrown out the window for various reasons. But history's brought it back, and you see that also in you know, David's subject. Political economy is now huge in political science too. So I see all this as maybe it's unhealthy for the world because we're reacting to some terrible developments. But in terms of the sort of subject, it seems to me to be positive and just more interesting than it used to be. So thanks everybody for participating in this debate. Thanks to the audience for listening in. Would anybody like to? If anybody's got a final word? I don't see anybody putting their hands up, so I'll pass it back to Wendy.
Yeah, this has been really fascinating for me. I have so many more questions as I think the people in the audience will have. Just one, I just want to say a couple of things. One is to add another visualization, which has a close connection with Branko, and this is what we call the core skyscraper depiction of inequality, where we show inequality by deciles, by country, across the world, and how that has transformed since 1980. Because to get students engaged, young kids engaged, you just show them that picture, you show them the first shot of the world lined up in 1980, and you say, what's wrong with this picture? And most kids will say, well, it's clearly wrong because everything is made in China, and the picture shows China right at the bottom of the world income distribution. And you say, yeah, that's right, it was 1980. And you press the button and you watch the world change before your eyes. And China leaps up the world income distribution, and the profile, the skyscrapers emerge at the back of the top deciles in China as well as throughout the world. So it's another one to add to the motivating images of global and within country inequality. And the other comment is really picking up Anna's plea about diversification in economics, and to really encourage people, everyone, to take a look at what we're doing in the core project and how we weave the study of inequality through teaching micro and macro, and as a way of trying to pull in and keep a different kind of audience in studying economics, asking these questions that have come up today. So if you haven't had a look, take a look at the website, dig in, and you'll see how it's possible to teach economics now in quite a different way, and that touches much more closely on the research that's being done. In every classroom around the world, where we ask beginning students what's the main subject economists today should be studying, the answer comes out from thousands and thousands of students now that we've collected the data over 10 years, is always inequality. So on that note, optimistic about what we should be studying, but very grounded in the problems that we still have to tackle. Thank you, everyone, and I look forward to more of these kind of occasions of sharing our thoughts. So thank you very much, and it's over and out from us in the UK.